I think there's two things to say. Both weekends were disgraceful. What happened on the first weekend was equally disgraceful. People throwing bikes at police horses, etc., was just as bad. I think what may have happened this time is the police would have had different intelligence, because I think it was an operational decision. And of course, unfortunately, they were proven to be right. There was a fair amount of trouble. Also, as well, the police would have dealt with these groups in the past, so would have had a much better idea of what they were actually going to be dealing with on the ground.
Well, yeah, indeed. I mean, there was no doubt at all. You're just watching the images that were being put out by, journalists watching it, that those people were there for a rock. They were there for a fight. There are some people who would argue that boarding up the statue of Winston Churchill and other statues and the soft touch policing last week paved the way and made it entirely predictable, not justifying it, but entirely predictable, that the far right would say, hold on a minute, you're not protecting what we feel strongly about. We're going to come in and we are going to protest ourselves. This was entirely predictable, was it not? I mean, I'm not justifying it for a nanosecond, but no one could possibly have thought after the weekend before that the far right weren't going to turn up this weekend.
Actually, I think what happened is when the Mayor of London said he would now run a commission deciding which statues and plaques and roads will be renamed and removed, that's what gave the far right the invitation to the party, as it were. Up until that point, it was all about Black Lives Matter and how they interacted with the police and the wider public. Once you'd jumped on a bandwagon of removing statues in a not particularly democratic way and then boarded up the Winston Churchill statue in panic, it then said to people, OK, it's your turn now, we're provoking people. I think the real problem here, it looked like that the mayor had chosen a side. So, of course, the opposition, as it were, mounted up and out they came.
OK, but again, the mayor chosen a side. I think most right-thinking people would choose the side of anti-racist protesters over far-right protesters. I know I would. I'm not a fan of Black Lives Matter as an organisation.
Julie, I beg to differ. The only side the mayor should choose is a side of law and order. The only side he should choose is bringing people together. What he shouldn't do is make actions that inflame a very, very incendiary situation in the first place. That's what I mean when I say he chose a side.
And there will be some particular issues as a result of this. One particular photograph of a man from the far-right organisation urinating next to PC Keith Palmer's memorial. People absolutely appalled by that. But then there was some rather, encouraging images. A Black Lives Matter protester, Patrick Hutchinson, who's a personal trainer. He was there. He basically wanted to make sure there wasn't trouble. He and his personal trainer friends had travelled wanting to make sure they could protect people, and he actually ended up carrying out a white protester, we think is from a far right group, who'd been attacked, and he carried him to safety, fearing that he would have died if he didn't carry him out to safety. And I think a lot of people were quite moved by that image. I mean, two very different images from the weekend.
But that's the issue here, isn't it? This is a very complex issue. For lots of your listeners who may not be, for people listening, I am a black man, if you didn't know that. And for lots of your listeners who may feel they're 100 miles away from the black community, I would say this: remember, this is about Britain. This is about what it is to be British. And as British people, I think we can hold our heads high because we're fair-minded. So therefore, we have to address these sometimes very difficult conversations, this particular one involving race. What you saw on that day was some people just came to make the point, this issue needs to be discussed. Other people came to have a fight. But it's complicated and we're going to have to get through it. That's why we need cool heads. That's why we need people who really want to deal with this and not use it and hang their own issues on and try and make something else out of it. That's something that Black Lives Matter has to deal with, and so something that we all have to deal with to make sure we have a proper conversation and not just a big fight.
Don't you think that your party leader needed to have spoken out quicker and more firmly in the manner of the French President Emmanuel Macron, who yesterday said to the French nation, "I will be very clear tonight, compatriots. The Republic," meaning France, "won't erase any name from its history. It will forget none of its artworks. It won't take down statues." Made it very, very clear he will not erase history. We've not quite seen a lot of that strength of message from our government, have we?
I beg to differ. Look, far be it from me to defend Boris. I'm sure he's big enough and ugly enough to defend himself. The point I would make is he came out very quickly on Twitter and said how he felt about the statue renaming. He's written a long piece in one of the papers about it as well. But the real issue is he shouldn't have to do that. We shouldn't have official bodies in this country suggesting we will just wipe away our history. That doesn't serve the black community and it certainly doesn't serve the British. So why would we do that? History is complicated. One man's hero is another man's villain, and we need to go through the process and look at that. And the idea that we'll wipe it away and it won't cause trouble is ridiculous. It now means we'll be gazing at our navels for a very long time, and it will root up some really deep, deep problems if we allow it to happen.
And it won't help a single disadvantaged child, black or white, to get on with their lives.
Precisely.
OK, Shaun Bailey, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Tory candidate for Mayor of London. Of course, his election is supposed to be held in May now next year. Let's turn to Norman Brennan. He's a retired London police officer of 31 years' experience and director of the Law and Order Foundation. Norman, good morning to you.
Yeah, good morning, Julia.
I can't imagine how much your blood must have been boiling, not just last weekend with the violence against police officers from Black Lives Matter protesters, but again from far-right protesters this weekend. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's absolutely disgusting. The police service are in the middle of all of this. They're the ones between right and wrong, good and bad. And they don't want to fight anybody. They want to be at home and they want to be on their own boroughs, policing the rest of London. But here they are, 2 weeks running and often sometimes during the week, getting together in numbers and becoming the Aunt Sallies of society. They become punch bags. You're absolutely right. Earlier on, you said that there were a number of veterans, both black and white, that turned up, and they behaved exemplary. You've got to ask yourself now, is it mob rule? Is it that if the government or the establishment doesn't do what one particular group of demonstrators wants, then there's going to be violence? And what I think we're all concerned about is this, is at what point do shops start being looted, burnt down, and people terrorised? And that is what I see coming. And the caveat to that, Julia, is this, is that I believe the mainstream media have behaved absolutely appalling. They've stoked up much of the hatred. There's already hatred behind the scenes already. And they've absolutely annihilated the British Police Service throughout the coronavirus. And now there's an excuse to do it, whilst there are certain people in Britain that wouldn't mind if a police officer was killed in these demonstrations. And the way it's going, I can see that happening.
Yeah, we could have lost a WPC, the Black Lives Matter protest, when she was, something was thrown at her horse bolted, she hit a traffic light. It's luck that she's alive rather than anything else. And a lot of people are very concerned about mob rule. And again, this idea that I'm unhappy about something, even if it's something that's happened in another country, but I'm unhappy about something in this country, whether you're an anti-racism campaigner or whether you're from the far right. And I'm not equating these morally, but wherever you are, going out on the streets and being violent and attacking police officers is never acceptable.
Well, it appears to be so. I look at some of these people and they're saying to my police colleagues that are black and white, men and women, that just want to go out and do the job and protect society. You're scum. You're pigs. Well, they're neither scum nor pigs. They're people that absolutely rips their lives day in and day out to protect society. And I just don't know where it's going. And the biggest concern that I've got is that there are millions of people living at home now that have gone through the most dreadful of 3-month period in recent history. Many have lost businesses, their jobs, and what they don't want to do is to keep on seeing police officers beaten up and attacked week in and week out.
Absolutely.
And the other thing is as well, Julia, is that I haven't seen one white face, I haven't heard one white voice stand up and say, I have heard all of the allegations, but let me tell you, there's answers to most of them. And at the end of the day, it's like this. We have heard the prosecution, and it looks as though the British Police Service and many millions of people in Britain have been hung, drawn and quarter on allegations and on an incident that happened over 4,000 miles away. And the last 4 black people that many police officers have been accused of killing were terrorists on the streets of London and the streets of Streatham. Now, you tell me, was that an unlawful killing that saved many people's lives, yet we're accused of it weekend in and
Yeah,
weekend
I
out?
think likening the British police to the American police is quite absurd. Just finally, can I ask your thoughts about the man who's now been identified, who urinated next to the memorial plaque to PC Keith Palmer, who died fighting a terrorist just out Parliament? Your reaction to that as a former police officer?
Well, it disgusted us all. I posted on it, and it got a huge response over the weekend. But it isn't just him, Julia. Look at all the other crimes that have been committed. Look at all the other people that have seen the police officers battered week in and weekend out. They have committed very, very serious offences, desecrating Winston Churchill and the memorials. That is not the message, because once you start threatening society that if you don't listen and act upon our demands, we are going to cause mayhem, damage.
Okay.
And wanton damage of burning people's properties and businesses down. You cannot have the gun held to society's head to demand by violence. You negotiate, you sit down and you talk. The message, I'm afraid, is being lost.
How much help is the government planning to give those non-essential shops? Are we going to be looking at, say, a cut in VAT to encourage people to go back to the stores and spend?
Well, I think we'll see what the Chancellor decides on, any measures he needs to introduce. What we've done right the way through this entire pandemic is to make sure that we've got flexibility in the support that we've given. So we worked pretty quickly, I think, on most things, whether it's the loans, whether it's the job retention scheme extending and changing that, flexing that. And so we'll see what happens over the next few days. But importantly today, it's a step. It's it's a small step, but it's going to have a big effect on our economy if we get it right, to make sure that people can go out safely, and as long as they're acting sensibly, to be able to shop again.
Well, the next key stage, of course, will be getting not just more children back to school, absolutely vital, but also getting the hospitality industry back up. It's a huge part of our GDP, the tourism industry as well. And they've basically said, we're going to go under. If you keep to the 2 metre rule, we are not financially viable. And if you do keep to that rule, we are going to start laying people off. The furlough scheme, we're going to have to start contributing towards. There's no chance of us being able to rehire these people. How soon could that 2 metre rule be got rid of? And what happens under this review? What is being reviewed by the Prime Minister?
So it's a comprehensive review on all of the evidence that we've got about 2 metres. I've worked with the hospitality sector pretty much most days. They've made it really clear that the fact it's something like 30% capacity typically for a 2 metre opening, 1.5 metres like they have in Germany, it's about 50, 1 metre like they have in America, it's about 70% capacity. And that's really important for them. What we've got to make sure, though, that we can match that with the health guidance, because the government's first priority is always about saving lives, but restoring livelihood, protecting jobs, protecting businesses, so that we can get the economy motoring again gradually is really, really important. So there's a lot of work that we've got to do with the best scientific advice to make sure that we're not gold plating it, looking at the international comparisons to see what's happening there, and so that's what has to go into the mix. And we'll have to make a decision. It's the government, the politicians, that will make the decision based on that best scientific advice.
Well, you get it's best scientific advice, but why is it that France and Singapore, why do all these other countries have completely different advice? Why does the World Health Organization have different advice and say that 1 metre is enough? You say the government's priority is saving lives. Well, the government's got lots of different priorities, which is why different decisions are made at different times and why different medical experts can disagree, because we can't save every single life. That's never been possible and actually should not be desirable, because it's a trade-off. And you wouldn't wreck the entire British economy to save one life. So we know that there is a trade-off, but that we will be slightly more at risk at 1 metre rather than 2 metres. But isn't that not a risk that people are willing to take to not see our economy completely collapse?
Well, which is why we're doing the comprehensive review. And I think what we're going to do, if we're going to make difficult decisions, we've got to do it based on the best evidence. I think that's the key thing. So that's why the international comparisons are a good thing to look at, to understand, because it's not like the WHO come up with a 1 metre rule and everybody's doing the same thing. So why is that happening? Is it different populations? Is it different scales? Is it the way that their society and their behavioural economics works. These are all kind of things that we need to factor in, which we will do over the coming days.
Okay, well, let's also talk about what the point is of having a 2-metre rule and people having face coverings and the like on public transport when there are mass protests every single weekend in central London, which the police don't seem to do anything about. Yes, we had far more robust policing this weekend when the far-right protesters turned out. The Black Lives Matter protest, the official one, was actually cancelled. But what is the point of everyone else being careful all this time and not, hugging our grandparents and things like that, and our kids not seeing their friends, when there are thousands and thousands of people who are standing around having mass protests, fighting with the police, and nothing is done to stop it from happening?
When you say nothing is done, I mean, I think it's difficult to actually to be able to work in a protest of those size. But clearly, first of all, if you look at the violence that's happened over the last few weeks, that's totally unacceptable, and it's just really undermining, the debate that we need to have in terms of the actual congregating. Again, as you rightly say, it's undermining everything that people have worked for 3 months. Many of those people will say, I'm going out socially distanced, I've got my mask on. It's just not possible to do that when you're in with thousands and thousands of people.
But then why are these protests still allowed to happen?
The Home Secretary has been really clear about pushing back and saying that this is not acceptable. You cannot do this. But when you have thousands of people, you then do need to work out how you police that carefully so that not to incite more or not incite, but
but Paul Scully, that's what's happened, hasn't it? Is basically the police don't have control of the streets, and even when they were in their riot gear on Saturday, didn't have control of the streets. And the government's answer seems to be a few tweets from Boris Johnson about, oh yes, we're not going to get rid of Winston Churchill's statue, but we're happy to board it up rather than protect it properly. But also to bring in a 10-year sentence for anyone found guilty of desecrating a war memorial. Now, this is just knee-jerk populism of the worst kind. What we want is the memorials not desecrated. What we want is proper policing. Sentencing someone to 10 years behind bars, it's more than they get for raping someone, for goodness sake. That's ridiculous.
So, look, I mean, in terms of policing, I think this was the preempting of this weekend. I think did actually see some of the protests cancelled, and I think that's the right way to do it. We do need to be absolutely firm. We do need to make sure that the people, when we see people planning protests online through social media, that we do that come in at that point to try and stop it. You're absolutely right. So we'll have to see where we go from now, what's happening in terms of the protests around the country, and make sure that we can keep on developing the way that we are pushing back, both through government and through the police as well, because congregating more than 6 people in one place is against the law, and so we do need to stamp down on that.
Yeah, I'm getting a bit late now. I mean, just finally, we are in, it would appear, a massive culture war where people are losing their jobs because they're not saying the correct words, not even saying anything racist or unpleasant, but simply giving their own opinions. We're seeing, the blue plaques are all going to be questioned, statues toppled, halls renamed, schools renamed, universities taking down their mottos. Is it time for this government to stand up very firmly in defence of Britain's culture and history and say, yes, you know what, our country isn't perfect, no country is perfect, and no one's history is perfect, the past isn't perfect, but to stand up on behalf of the vast majority of your constituents and every MP's constituents who just thinks that these culture wars are absolutely absurd?
If you talk about a culture war, then clearly that just doesn't help anybody, as you rightly say. The Prime Minister has launched a commission to work out what to take all the data that we've got to actually put it into meaningful action to make sure that whether you're a black child, whether you're an Asian child, whether you're a white British child, that you're getting equal opportunities and learning the lessons from there. But that does not mean that people should be sitting there, as you say, trying to rewrite history. You're absolutely right when you talk about the fact that characters in our history are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. We should teach people about the differences, and so they can have a deeper understanding of our history rather than trying to rewrite it or erase it.
Right now, let's talk more about those protests on Saturday. Eleanor Penny is a left-wing commentator and journalist, and she joins us right now. Good morning, Eleanor.
Good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
doing?
I'm very well indeed. I would say I was pretty angry about the protests at the weekend, and pretty angry about the protest the weekend before. Does it make a difference if people are protesting because they're with Black Lives Matter or because they're with a right-wing, a far-right sort of Britain First type group, whether or not the protest should be policed in a particular sort of way? Because we did see a massive difference in terms of the way the police approached the policing of those two groups. Do you think the police were right to do that?
Well, I think you're completely right to point out that there has been an enormous discrepancy between the ways in which these two groups were protested. If you've seen any of the clips, which I encourage everyone listening to go and find, the protesters on Saturday who were doing Sieg Heil, Nazi-type salutes, who were chanting things like, "We're racist and that's the way they like it," were openly spoiling for a fight with police officers, punching them, attacking them, and they were getting much more of a sort of placatory, de-escalation-orientated type approach to policing, whereas the largely peaceful Black Lives Matter protests the weekend before and the weeks before that were seeing horse charges, we're seeing batons, we're seeing the kind of kettling and information harvesting tactics that human rights...
You think the opposite from what lots of people have been saying, which is that the police came down much harder on the far-right protesters. The thing is, I mean, look, it was a much bigger march, the Black Lives Matter march the week before, and yes, largely peaceful. I accept that the vast majority of people on that march were peaceful, although they were all breaking the law, as the people were on Saturday under the lockdown. However, 27 police officers were injured the weekend before. 23 officers were injured this weekend, which suggests that the amount of violence was pretty consistent.
Well, I mean, you're right to point out that the BLM protests were much bigger, and therefore that implies that a much smaller proportion of the actual overall crowd were being violent. And also we need to point out that amongst those casualties of police officers were police officers who were injured, for instance, in the mounted charges by accident, not by protesters themselves.
No. A bicycle was thrown at the police horse. No, that's not true. A bicycle was thrown at the police horse, and the police horse bolted, and that's when the police officer came. That was still a direct result of violence. The police horse didn't just suddenly bolt because it felt like it.
I mean, it was a lamppost that was actually the thing that delivered the injury. But let's not haggle over
facts.
That particular kind of detail, because
Facts.
I think we need to step back and look at the broader picture here, which is that the human rights watch group Liberty has called the policing tactics used against Black Lives Matter protesters potentially illegal and a potential threat to our right to protest. And of course, everyone has the right to protest, and rightly so. Even including people who I'm terrified, quite frankly, to see on the streets doing Nazi salutes.
Oh, so am I. I'm horrified by those people. But just finding this, because we haven't got much time, and apologies for that. I'd love to talk to you for longer. But I mean, I'm horrified by the people we saw on the streets on Saturday, those far-right groups, Nazi salutes and shouting we're racist and being proud of that, which basically is a way of shouting out I'm stupid and being proud of it, but rather more sinister. The urinating next to the plaque for the PC Keith Palmer, who died fighting a terrorist outside Westminster, and all that. Everything about that was absolutely positive. Do you not think, though, it was entirely predictable that the far right would want to make a stand, would want to make their presence felt after what had happened, the Black Lives Matter protest the week before, the pulling down of statues, the defacing and desecrating of war memorials and statues to Winston Churchill, widely regarded by the British public as our greatest wartime Prime Minister. Not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's justifiable, but was it not entirely predictable?
I think there's a lot of truth in that, and I think that fact means that we've got a real sort of moment to examine who we are as a society, because I think that it would be easy to be able to distance ourselves from that and say that there's no connection between our culture at large and how we talk about the past and the way in which we give space for these far-right narratives.
Give space. I mean, this is a tiny minority. It's a few hundred people. They don't represent the vast majority of the British public.
But you were just saying that this kind of thing was inevitable. In fact, there was thousands of people out on the streets. And not only that, but they were harassing, they were targeting different people who were just trying to go about their businesses, right? People of colour, people who they suspected of being so-called counter-protesters. This is not something that we can minimise here. This is a real and direct threat to our democracy at large, because let's take a step back here. This is what happened when black people took to the streets asking for equality, and some people were so outraged by that fact that they saw fit to attack police officers, harass passers-by, and do Nazi salutes. Like, that's the situation we're in, and we need to take this completely seriously.
But again, there is no reason to believe, and the polls show us, and people's voting shows us, and how people behave in their everyday lives. The far-right protesters, there were some veterans who were behaving perfectly respectfully and peacefully on trying to guard statues. They're not part of that far-right group, but there's no reason to think, there's no evidence whatsoever that far-right group represents anybody else other than themselves in this country. Obviously, lots of people focused on those violent protests on Saturday, far right coming out, I think rather predictably, following the handling of the mass protest the week before. Do you think, A, that we should actually go with the police have asked, the Met Police, a ban on mass protests during lockdown? I mean, a lot of us thought they were already banned. And B, that actually now, during a pandemic, economic crisis, this is not the time for a culture war about re-examining the history of this country and every single person who doesn't match up to the perfect morals of today?
Well, it's definitely not the time for a culture war, and it's really not the time for mass gatherings either. And but people, we've been calling for people to try and make their voice heard in other ways if they feel that they have to attend protests, to observe social distancing, to wear face masks, and take all of those things into consideration, because we are in the middle of a pandemic, and that is issue. But really, the government could help this situation a lot more by actually coming forward with some real concrete actions, and not just going into yet another review when we've had many reviews already that have happened with lots of recommendations, none of which have yet been actioned. And that's the starting point I'd like to see.
Let's turn our attention now back to the protests at the weekend, and the violent protests and the desecration of war memorials and the graffiti on Winston Churchill's statue and others has prompted two Tory MPs to put forward a new bill, the Desecration of War Memorials Bill. This would actually give a sentence of up to 10 years for anyone who desecrates a war memorial. It's being to be considered by ministers. One of those two Tory MPs is Stoke-on-Trent North MP Jonathan Gullis, who joins us now. Good morning to you, Jonathan.
Good morning, Julia.
I know there'll be a lot of people who were horrified, as I was, by anyone desecrating the war memorial, indeed a statue, any of that sort of violence. But isn't saying a 10-year sentence for a damage to property, even if it is something as significant and important to the nation as a cenotaph, actually just the worst kind of knee-jerk politics?
So we need to remember that, first of all, the 10 years is obviously the maximum, and it's in for the judge's discretion to decide within that, with what act has happened as to how far it should go. I don't think it's a knee-jerk reaction. This was first proposed back in 2009-2010 by David Burrows MP when he attempted, but sadly wasn't able to get it through. And if we look at our Commonwealth partners, for example, in Canada, America and Australia, they have specific laws in place for such offences, and I think we just need to catch up.
What difference do you think it would make? Do you think they'd go, I really wanted to face the cenotaph, I've got no respect for the people who died to keep this country safe, and even to give these people, both sets of protesters the last couple of weekends, the right to even go out onto the streets and protest, but it's a 10-year sentence, not, I don't know, a 5-year sentence, so I won't do it. Do you think it will actually make a difference?
I believe it will, one, give the police more confidence to enforce powers, obviously to protect these monuments, not have to have them boarded up as we've seen, but also to ensure that when people come before the court, we see the full force of the law thrown against them. At the end of the day, my great-great-uncle, Alan Gullis, he's a D-Day veteran, he's still alive with us today. My grandfather was a Marine in the Suez Crisis. So, military background, we've all got a link to it. Someone in our family has paid the ultimate sacrifice in some cases, or luckily we're able to come home safe. And as someone whose step-grandmother grew up under Nazi Germany rule, And to see some of the disgusting scenes that people thought they were able to do Nazi salutes outside the cenotaph, which is just despicable and reprehensible, then, I think it's more important that we have these laws in place to ensure that tougher punishments are sent down.
Well, all right-thinking people are going to agree with everything you just said then, but I'm not entirely sure this is either going to deter people or that the courts will hand these sort of sentences down. The reality is people serve less time than 10 years for child abuse and rape in this country.
Well, Julia, one of the things I'm a big supporter of is tougher sentences in general, and obviously I would like to see those sentences go up. And then under this government, we've seen things like terrorism sentences increase up to 14 years minimum term. So, I think it's time for a wide sweeping reform of our criminal justice system in terms of looking at sentences and are they tough enough? And I certainly would be one of those who would support seeing them get tougher.
Okay. Just finally, I suppose the crucial issue for most people is not the sentence that someone gets when they're finally, hopefully successfully prosecuted for these crimes, is the police preventing these crimes in the first place by actually policing these protests properly.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Julia, and this is what this bill would ideally do, is to put it firmly in the mind of our leaders of the police. It's not the police officers on the ground, it's the commissioners, it's the chief constables. It's ensuring that they know very clearly there is a specific law in place with a tough sentence, and therefore they need their police officers to guard these important monuments.